This video includes a discussion of serious crimes, which may be disturbing for some viewers, so I wanted to let you know that up front. But I think it's necessary to talk about these crimes in some detail for reasons that will become apparent. In the small town of Visalia, California in the mid-1970s, one of the state's most prolific criminals got his start. He repeatedly broke into houses and stole small items like cash, coins, and jewelry. He was dubbed the Visalia Ransacker, but soon his crimes escalated.
6 months later, in 1976, he moves up to Sacramento, and over the course of the next 3 years is moving all across Northern California, committing numerous sexual assaults, over 50 sexual assaults.
Here, he was called the East Area Rapist.
The police are saying lock up tight. Sacramento's infamous East Area Rapist may still be in town.
And then in 1979, he moves down to Southern California, starting in Santa Barbara, and starts killing. And he was known as the original Night Stalker in Southern California.
Variously known as the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, these were brutal, meticulously planned crimes that spanned numerous California counties between 1976 and 1986.
Police believed that all of these crimes were committed by the same person, now known as the Golden State Killer. How was it known that these were committed by the same person?
Investigators were relying on MO. MO, modus operandi, is basically how a criminal will commit a crime.
Was wearing some type of a mask or a hood. Was wearing shorts and a t-shirt.
The Golden State Killer had a very distinctive MO.
What he would do is he would break into a house with a gun, a house with a man and a woman. He would tie them up, tell the man, I'm going to put plates on your back. If I hear those plates move, I'm going to kill your wife and then kill you. Take the wife into another room and sexually assault her. Then he would go through the house for however much time, eating, stealing stuff, stealing little things or whatever, and then he would leave.
How was he not caught based on fingerprint evidence?
Well, he didn't leave his fingerprints. He always wore a mask. He always had gloves on. This was an offender that did everything to prevent himself from being caught.
The Golden State Killer has been linked to at least 12 murders, 50 rapes, and a string of burglaries throughout California.
How you doing?
So we supply DNA sequencing solutions to the forensic laboratories that process crime scene DNA. At a crime scene, there's typically less than a nanogram of DNA left, and it's usually degraded. Right, so it breaks down DNA.
Why is there so little at a crime scene? A nanogram?
Yes.
That's insane.
Yes.
There's no accident that he stops in 1986. 1986 is when the first DNA case of a murder case is actually solved with DNA. And I think he's following that, and he's saying, you know what I'm doing here, I'm leaving my DNA. I can't do this anymore.
Investigator Paul Holes tracked the Golden State Killer for decades.
He couldn't account for DNA technology, and that really was his big mistake. That was the critical mistake. He left his DNA all over California. And it turns out that 3 of the cases, I had 3 sexual assault kits, and that's where I got the Golden State Killer's DNA from Northern California.
But having the unknown killer's DNA wasn't enough. They needed to match it to a known sample. In 1990, the FBI started work on what would become a national genetic database. It mainly stores DNA profiles from convicted criminals and persons of interest. It's called the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS for short. In each of your cells, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes, one from your mom and one from your dad. And at particular places on some chromosomes, there are short sections of DNA that repeat. Like AATG, 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 and so on. These are called short tandem repeats, or STRs, and different people have different numbers of repeats. Forensic labs produce STR profiles by counting up the number of repeats at each location. Initially, there were only 13 places on the DNA where STRs were counted, but in 2017, that was expanded to 20. It feels to me like that's not that much information.
It isn't.
but the chances of two people having the exact same number of repeats at all locations is incredibly small. The CODIS database now contains over 18 million STR profiles.
Golden State Killer's DNA profile has been up at the National DNA Database that's run by the FBI called CODIS since 2001 and has been searching ever since with no hits. We did Interpol searching, trying to search other countries' DNA databases, thinking, well, maybe he came from out of the country. That's why, after all this time, we have yet to be able to identify him. And obviously, we didn't get any hits.
But genetic sequencing technology was advancing rapidly.
The Human Genome Project was completed. Since 1986, scientists had been mapping and sequencing the 3 billion nucleotides contained in the human genome. It's anticipated.
Soon, private companies began offering genetic tests directly to consumers, and they provide far more genetic data than what's in the CODIS database. I traveled to Houston, Texas to visit Family Tree DNA headquarters.
We'll go in the lab and we'll start talking about the life cycle of a sample.
Okay. These samples, what are they?
So they're cheek cells. They just scrape the inside of their cheek, they put a cap on, and they send it back to us.
It's like a robot ballet.
Yes. So for DNA extraction, we need to remove all of the protections that are on the DNA and just separate it by itself so we can do testing on that.
Instead of looking at 20 places on your DNA, these tests examine 700 to 800,000.
The Family Finder test is based on what's called a microarray. And this is what a microarray looks like. Each one of those boxes is an individual. We can fit 24 individuals on here. And within that box is about 710,000 positions of your DNA that we're measuring. We're getting data for.
710,000.
Yes, and they're called SNPs.
So, hang on, that's like 710,000 individual bases, like ATGC.
Yes.
For each person, you can measure 24 on that single chip.
Correct.
The human genome consists of 3 billion bases. All people share about 99.9% the exact same DNA, which means, on average, only about 3 million bases differ from person to person. These individual letter changes are known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs.
So on there, are there a whole bunch of like little pieces of DNA then?
Yes. So what we have is a short piece of DNA that is specific to one SNP. So it's one position in the genome where we know there can be a difference.
Okay.
Is there any example of a simple SNP that, confers some sort of...
Actually, blue eyes is a single base change.
Really?
Yeah.
So everyone with blue eyes has this
There's a
one letter change.
You can see now it's starting to scan the first box.
The results of your 710,000 SNPs can tell you about your geographic ancestry or possible medical conditions, but they can also quantify how related you are to someone else. The genetics of having a kid are a bit like cutting 2 decks of cards together. The resulting deck will share about half its cards with each parent, and there will be long sequences of cards which match identically sequences in each parent. Now, if this deck has a kid, well then its offspring will share only about a quarter of its cards with each grandparent, and the sections of identical cards will be shorter. And this is how it works with DNA. The more closely you're related to someone, the more DNA you share, and the longer the blocks of identical DNA are. But to compare the DNA of 2 people, you don't need to read every letter. The SNPs are sprinkled throughout the DNA roughly every 2,000 bases. So if you find long sections where the SNPs match up, you can bet that the DNA in between is identical too. By comparing hundreds of thousands of SNPs sprinkled throughout the DNA, you can see where these identical blocks start and stop, and so how much total DNA is shared.
Everywhere that is highlighted in blue is where I share DNA.
With your father?
With my father. Which is exactly what you expect, because I should share DNA with him everywhere, because he gave me 50% of my DNA. So this is a second to third cousin. I have no idea who this person is. And you can see here, we are definitely not as closely related as me and my dad, because where the blue is, those are the only regions of the chromosome where we share DNA.
We all know that these genetic tests can help identify our relatives. But the question is, can you do the same thing with law enforcement databases? Can you identify family members using the CODIS database?
You can, and it's only limited to really first order and second order relatives.
That means if I'm looking for the Golden State Killer, I'm looking for either his father, his brother, or his son. We did that over and over and over again with no hits.
Why is it so limited?
Because you've only got 23 loci. If you want to do proper kinship analysis, you need to have more points assessed on that genome to see how related you really are.
We know the answer is behind the locked door. The answer is behind the locked door of 23andMe and Ancestry.com. We know that they have millions of profiles. Somebody related to him, a second cousin, I would guess, would be in there.
Sure.
And that was very hard to deal with. You know, that the answer is there behind this locked door.
Law enforcement is not allowed to search the databases of 23andMe and Ancestry.com, but luckily for investigators, there was another way. An independent website called GEDmatch had been set up to allow people to connect with relatives. You can upload the raw data from any of the big genetic testing companies and search for matches.
So when we initially search the GEDmatch database, our best hits come back at third cousins, which means they shared, our top hit, I think, shared about 1% of the DNA. It's very little DNA that's shared. But that's a starting data point. And theoretically, by taking multiple of these individuals that share DNA and building their family trees using traditional genealogy and public source documents like census records and obituaries and newspaper articles and findagrave.com, you build this family tree back until you get two of these relatives of the Golden State Killer. You get them to intersect. Now you see, they share great-great-grandparents together. Theoretically, Golden State Killer is a descendant from those same great-great-grandparents. So once I identify that common ancestor, it's now identifying every single descendant from those great-great-grandparents. This becomes a huge process. People in the 1840s would typically have 15 kids. You have to identify each of those kids, and then all of their children, and then all of their children. So now we have this exponentially growing family tree.
How wide did that tree get?
I think we had over 1,000 individuals in that family tree, but we knew a lot about our offender. We were confident he was born between 1940 and 1960. We knew he was a white male. We knew he was 5'8" to 5'10". He's in California. He's up in Sacramento in 1976. He's in Southern California in the 80s. We basically narrowed it down to about 5 males, and then it's just investigations.
With a suspect at their fingertips, this spring they followed him to a Sacramento area Hobby Lobby store and took a DNA sample from his car door handle. Days later, investigators recovered another DNA sample from one discarded tissue, which registered a match to DNA evidence left at one of the crime scenes.
Investigators in California say DNA evidence led them to one of the country's most notorious serial killers. Former police officer Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested yesterday, and he is believed to be the so-called Golden State Killer.
For 44 years, countless investigators have worked it and have failed to solve it. Within 4.5 months, a team of 6 were able to figure out who the Golden State Killer was, and that was Joseph D'Angelo.
After the Golden State Killer was identified, the floodgates opened. And we were seeing every week, not only single killers, but multiple killers, serial killers. Every week were being identified from cases in the 70s and 80s.
Because there's been over 70 cases now that they've solved this way. And they continue to solve them at a fairly regular rate. And I think...
Presumably that rate's just going to increase.
Yeah.
And there's going to be more. Because it's working, and we are going to, help find these people.
But the scary thing is, in the US, you have 100,000 cold case murders with DNA. You have more cold cases, but the ones with DNA is estimated about 100,000. There's roughly about 650,000 sexual assaults. Cold cases with DNA.
It seems like a real paradigm shift.
It is. Multiple law enforcement agencies have said that this is the most revolutionary tool they've had since the adoption of the fingerprint.
With traditional DNA, it required getting a sample from the actual individual. It's a one-to-one type of process. And so these offenders who, let's say they have committed crimes and they haven't been caught, and they're just living their life, and they're thinking, well, my DNA has never been taken from me. So I may have left DNA in the case that I committed back in 1975, but they've never gotten my DNA. They won't find me. But now, we don't have to rely upon that. Somebody distantly related to that offender has put their DNA into a database, and they have to start getting nervous because that's outside of their control. They can't account for a third cousin, what that third cousin is doing. And so they start getting nervous. And I've kind of wondered how many of these individuals recognize that law enforcement is eventually going to be knocking on their door as a result of a third cousin putting their DNA in the database.
Each person who uploads their information to a database illuminates the identities of hundreds of other people around them. Parents, siblings, aunts and uncles, and cousins. A study by Ancestry DNA found the average person in the UK has 175 third cousins. And it doesn't stop there. The DNA in one person will be shared by hundreds of people yet to be born. Children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews, and cousins once or twice removed. Realistically, each person shares identifiable DNA with nearly 1,000 people, past and future. So it doesn't take many people uploading their data to reveal the identities of everyone living in a country. Back in 2018, a study found that using an existing database of just 1.3 million people, they could identify 60% of all Americans of European descent. And they estimated with a database containing just 2% of the population, you could find a third cousin or closer match in 99% of cases.
DNA storage is one of the things that we have that is really unlike anything else. If you look inside, this is at minus 20 degrees Celsius.
That keeps the DNA good for a long time?
We have DNA samples in here that are probably about 15 years old.
How many samples are stored in there?
Just over 2 million.
Whoa!
Yeah. So the capacity is just over 2 million.
2 million people's DNA stored in this one small room.
Correct.
Wow.
By 2021, over 30 million people worldwide have taken a direct-to-consumer genetic test, the majority of which are through Ancestry and 23andMe, which do not currently work with law enforcement, but Family Tree DNA does.
If you ask Americans, should we have a national database where everyone's logged in it as their DNA, by their DNA and their name, most Americans will be somewhat uncomfortable or potentially very uncomfortable with that. But we're kind of sleepwalking into that scenario.
There are some people who are concerned with privacy. If anyone chooses or decides that they do not want their results to be used for law enforcement matching, they can remove themselves from that.
I do worry about genetic information being used to discriminate against someone.
My biggest thing is health insurance. I worry about if you have somebody's DNA profile and some law is enacted, gets in the wrong hands, and they say that this person has a proclivity, they're headed towards Parkinson's, they're headed towards this, and they're headed towards that, and then rates skyrocket. That's the biggest place that I see as a privacy concern.
Once your genetic information's out there, it's out there. It's not like a credit card where you can get a new one. Yeah, you're giving away something that you don't know what it could do.
Well, yeah, our information isn't ours in the first place. Like, our information is shared.
Yes, with your relatives.
Yes.
And although you may be adverse to this sort of thing, if they've already done it, in a way, you're out there.
In society today, you very clearly have two camps. There are those that are very comfortable having their genome available to be able to be searched for law enforcement purposes, and there are others that are not comfortable at all, and that's okay.
The problem is, of course, those people who don't want theirs to be searchable could have their DNA uploaded inadvertently by their relatives. Do you know what I mean? So, like, if I don't want my DNA to be searchable by law enforcement, but my sister uploads hers,
yes,
it's almost as good as me doing it myself.
Right now, Family Tree DNA's policy is we will only accept samples from law enforcement under certain circumstances. It has to be a sexual assault, identification of remains, DNA recovered from the scene of a homicide. And we also do child abductions. So if there's a child that's kidnapped and there's DNA evidence, we will process the DNA so they can try to find out who the abductor is. Those are the only cases that we will accept.
Unfortunately, now GEDmatch has flipped off the switch. And GEDmatch has actually said that you're not allowed to have your information searched without opting in.
Right. Was that decision by GEDmatch a direct result of this Golden State Killer case?
No, it wasn't. Can you tell the story?
You know, it had to do with a Utah case.
Where an elderly woman was playing the organ in a church.
And there was an individual who broke in and assaulted her.
But it wasn't a sexual assault, but it's a serious crime.
I believe tried to strangle her and left her for dead. I believe he thought that she was obviously dead and left. The police, I believe, approached GEDmatch because that they were concerned that he was going to recommit other crimes.
But GEDmatch's terms of service said they would only help law enforcement in cases of rape or homicide.
Her problem was that she didn't die.
Because if she died, then...
If she died, it wouldn't fit the conditions, and they would have uploaded the sample because it met the terms of service and everything.
So what happened? They didn't take that case?
They did.
They subsequently called the individual from that search that they performed on GEDmatch.
But people within the genealogy world kind of got their passions inflamed, saying that is stepping outside of what this tool should be used for, and they ended up putting a lot of pressure on GEDmatch.
They flipped the switch because they got freaked out.
But at the end of the day, it was a violation of terms of service, and I think ultimately led to a good thing. Everybody got zeroed out, and then everybody gets to sign back in.
Subsequently, GEDmatch was sold to Verigen.
I can tell you, a new user today, when they sign up for GEDmatch, about 73% of them are signing up to allow law enforcement to search. We're pretty happy with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a high number.
It's a high number.
And it suggests that people want that, in a sense.
How many second cousins or third cousins do you know? You know what I mean? You don't know that many of them. Without even knowing it, you're helping justice. You're helping a victim's family get a little bit of peace. Not closure, but a little bit of peace.
To get an answer.
Not?
Partly, you could make an argument that if you want to be an activist helping catch criminals, one of the best things you can do is, like, encourage everyone you know to be tested and put in the database.
Correct. And, there are millions of people who have tested at other companies that are not working with law enforcement. And if they want to help, all they have to do is download their raw data, and they can upload it for free into our database.
I absolutely believe in a person's right to privacy, but I also absolutely believe we have a right not to get murdered or sexually assaulted or be part, having violent crimes committed against us. There has to be an equal balance.
That scale of my privacy has been taken because of a third cousin has been identified versus a mother who's talking about her daughter has been murdered, that scale is way the hell like this.
We're at a point now where, in many ways, technology has kind of outstripped where the laws are. I truly believe that ultimately this tool and all the concerns with it will probably end up in front of the nation's Supreme Court, and there will be a decision. My bottom line message: if you're going to make a decision, If there's going to be laws restricting law enforcement to use it, make sure that you're making an informed decision and not assuming what it is based on its DNA and genetics of law enforcement, because it really isn't what you think it is.
I got to keep a couple million people happy so that I have access to the identities, kind of, in a sense.
In a sense, right?
Of millions, hundreds of millions of people.
Right.
And that's a pretty selective sample. These are people who are willing to give up their information to find their ancestors. Yeah. There may be many others who are militantly private, but they don't get a say in the decision of whether they're going to be searchable through that person.
True. That's the choice you make. So that, to me,
that's the choice you don't make.
It's a choice you don't make, but it's the choice we have to make as a society. Is what's that balance? There is always going to be winners and losers in my mind, right? And I don't want to use losers in the negative sense there, but in a decision, at the end of the day, you have to balance, in my mind, the public safety with the public privacy.
Is DuckDuckGo, is that good?
I use it. I'm a little paranoid. So it's supposed to not track you as much, I guess. But yeah.
I have been working on this video for a couple of years, so I really want to thank Brilliant for sponsoring it. I appreciate their willingness to support me tackling complex and important stories. Brilliant is a website and app that teaches you all kinds of STEM concepts in an interactive and in-depth way. If you want to learn more about DNA or solving mysteries with deductive reasoning, I would recommend their courses on computational biology and logic. Check out this interactive logic puzzle. You have to figure out if the light is on or off. No.
What do I love about my daughter?
What do I love about my kids?
I'm gonna cry.
I'll start crying.
My daughter is an old soul who teaches me how to be a better person every single day.
I love his heart. Like he loves big.
They are extremely smart and kind and opinionated, which I love.
He is so unique.
They see the bright side of everything. They have this altruistic love of people in the world. She's stunning and she's witty.
Very athletic, very charming.
Like, he actually makes me laugh. I'm not laughing because he's so cute. He's like legitimately funny.
Having these children to teach me how to love has probably been the best way for me to learn how to love.
I just appreciate that they're good people.
Is that?
How ironic is that? What you're talking about?
With us, that we begin this morning with President Biden in Edinburgh, Scotland, for the next leg of his latest international tour.
He's in the United Kingdom for the COP26 climate conference today. The president will deliver a statement as the summit kicks off this morning. He'll also attend several meetings with a range of world leaders, from UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson to the president of Indonesia. NBC News correspondent Josh Letterman joins us now from Edinburgh. He covers the Biden administration's climate policy. So, Josh, the president is in Scotland now. First up, what's on his agenda today?
Hey, Joe, yeah, we actually just watched the skies right behind me as Air Force One descended on Scotland. I was kind of surprised you could see it all the way from here, but now President Biden in Scotland, where he hopes to hit the ground running today with a busy day of meetings with the head of the UK, the British Prime Minister, as well as the Secretary General. And then Biden will give his major remarks to the COP26 summit, where he is really aiming.
삼성전자 모바일 사업부의 긴급 경영 진단 결과 대규모 조직 개편에 대한 소문까지 흘러나오면서 분위기가 심상치 않은데요. 들리는 소문으로는 연봉의 최대 3배를 제시하면서 희망퇴직을 종용한다는 소식부터 5G 통신 장비를 비롯한 네트워크 사업부가 미국 기업에 매각된다는 루머까지 나왔다고 합니다. 갤로트 세븐의 발화 사태 이후 5년 만에 진행된 고강도 경영 진단은 더욱 치열해지는 스마트폰 시장과 코로나와 경기 침체로 인한 대내외적인 악재로 실시된 것으로 알려졌습니다. 아직까지 확정된 소식은 없지만 경영 진단이 마무리된 만큼 대대적인 변화가 예고된 상황입니다. 이어서 출시 루머가 끊임없이 나오는 갤럭시 S22 소식인데요. IT 팁스터 아이스 유니버스는 삼성전자의 갤럭시 S22 울트라 후면 패널 유출본을 공개했습니다. 해당 디자인은 컨투어컷 디자인과 달리 물방울 디자인으로 개별 렌즈가 구분된 모습을 가지고 있는데요. 마치 벨벳과 닮은 느낌으로 카메라에 집중할 것으로 전망되고 있습니다. 다양한 루머에 근거해서 만들어진 렛츠고 디지털의 렌더링을 살펴보면 S펜 수납을 비롯해 노트 시리즈의 아이덴티티인 각진 모서리 마감이 눈에 띄는데요. 무엇보다 카툭티가 심하지 않다는 점에서 구조적인 변화를 짐작하게 해줬습니다. 그러니까 전체적인 두께를 더 늘리면서 자체 배터리 용량을 5000mAh로 유지하고 동시에 S펜 수납과 무난한 카툭티를 선택했다는 것이죠. 무리한 두께 다이어트보다는 실용성에 집중하면서 S와 노트 시리즈를 통합하는 최초 라인업으로 만들겠다는 것일지 모릅니다. 특히 유출된 컬러가 그대로 담겨진 렌더링은 심플하고 깔끔한 화이트 컬러부터 단정하고 매트한 느낌의 블랙과 강렬한 레드 컬러까지 보여줬는데요. 거기다 새롭게 유출된 그린 컬러를 비롯해 울트라 시리즈가 최대 5가지 컬러 라인업이 될 가능성을 보여주기도 했습니다. 카메라 구성은 1억 화소 메인 카메라부터 1200만 화소 초광각 카메라, 3배와 10배 광학줌을 품은 1200만 화소 듀얼 망원 카메라를 비롯해 레이저 AF 센서가 탑재될 전망입니다. 하지만 전면 셀피용은 UPC 대신 화질에 집중하면서 갤폴드 3와는 다른 방향성을 가질 예정인데요. 현재까지 나온 루머에 따르면 외장 메모리를 탑재하지 않은 S22 울트라는 최대 512기가 스토리지로 별도의 1테라 모델은 선보이지 않는다고 합니다. 이렇게 되면 기본형 라인업과 전혀 다른 길을 걷게 되는 최초의 갤럭시 S 시리즈로 이원화 전략이 더욱 강화될 전망입니다. 기본형 라인업은 저렴한 가격과 플래그십에 기대하는 퍼포먼스를 품은 모델로 여전히 플라스틱 후면을 탑재할 가능성이 많은데요. 카메라 성능을 비롯해 일부 기능에서의 차이로 대다수의 소비자들을 위한 기기가 될 것으로 보입니다. 반대로 갤럭시 S22 울트라는 기존 갤로트 소비자들을 흡수하는 데 더해 S 시리즈의 강점인 카메라 성능을 더욱 다듬어서 올인원 디바이스가 될 전망인데요. 디자인에서부터 차이가 큰 모델이 되는 만큼 따로 또 가치 전략으로 선보일 가능성이 많은 거죠. 관전 포인트는 S 시리즈와 노트 시리즈의 장점을 더할 수 있을지 아니면 애매한 제품으로 정체성을 잃어버릴지 하는 점인데요. S 시리즈와 노트 시리즈에 기대하는 소비자들의 눈높이를 맞춰줄 수 있을지 지켜봐야 할 것 같습니다. 이외에도 새로운 엑스노스의 성능부터 성능 유지력, 발열 관리, 동영상 촬영 성능 개선을 비롯해 배터리 성능까지 해결해야 할 과제가 많은데요. 다양한 해결 과제부터 삼성전자 내부적인 경영 진단과 구조 조정까지 갤럭시 S22 시리즈는 계속해서 판매량이 줄어드는 갤럭시 S 시리즈의 이미지 회복을 위해 꼭 성공해야만 하는 큰 책임이 주어진 모델이기도 합니다. 어떤가요? 과연 갤럭시 S22 시리즈는 예상을 뛰어넘는 변화로 기대를 넘어선 성적을 거두게 될까요? 하루가 멀다 하고 자꾸만 바뀌는 디자인이 갤럭시 S 시리즈의 정체성을 더해줄 수 있을지 관심을 가지고 지켜봐야겠습니다. 그러면 저는 또 다른 이야기로
시간여행자라고 조용히 된 사람은 없죠. 하지만 시간여행자라고 주장하는 사람들은 언제나 있어 왔어요. 그래서 오늘은 이 시간여행은 가능한 것이고 또는 시간여행을 경험한 사람이 있는가를 제가 증명을 해보려고 합니다. 믿을 수밖에 없게 되는 어떤 증거들이 나와서
진짜?
시간여행에 관련된 그렇습니다. 시간여행에 관련된 이게 뭐야?
나는 방금 병원에서 깨어났습니다. 내게 무슨 일이 일어난 건지 모르겠습니다. 오늘은 2027년 2월 13일이고 도시에는 나 혼자입니다.
에?
2027년 2월 발렌시아, 스페인. 인류는 존재서다. 난 도시에 혼자 있다.
어디 가든 아무도 없다라는 거를 얘기해주고 싶었구나. 지하철역이 아무도 없네.
이렇게 아무도 없다고? 이거 병원이다. 병원에 사람이 없을 리가 없잖아. 그렇죠. 병원은 좀 특이하다.
아무도 없어.
경찰서에도 사람이 없기는 어렵잖아. 그렇게 이제 한두 군데가 아니라 예를 들어서 뭐 거리, 병원을 통제하기 쉽지 않잖아.
그죠. 통제가 불가능한 것만.
경찰서 그런 것들은
김상욱 교수님.
네. 여러분 물리학자 김상욱 교수님을
안녕하세요. 제일 핫한 거 같은데요. 교수님이 이제 방송하시는 거 보고 엄청 팬이 됐는데 뵙자마자 제가 이런 질문을 드리게 될 줄 몰랐네요. 시간 여행이 진짜 말이 된다고 생각하세요, 교수님?
그 시간 여행이라는 거를 이제 우리가 물리적으로 이야기를 하려면은 20세기 초에 아마 들어보셨을 아인슈타인의 상대성 이론이 나오는데 그 상대성 이론은 정말 놀랍게도 그 대상이 시간과 공간이에요. 시간과 공간이 우리와 완전히 별개로 분리되어 절대적으로 흘러가고 있거나 절대적으로 존재하는 것이 아니라 시간을 보는 사람이 어떤 상태인지에 따라 이게 바뀔 수도 있고, 그래서 상대성 이론을 가지고 잘 이제 다루다 보면 이론적으로는 가능하다는 증거들이 있어요. 블랙홀 근처를 갔다 온 사람은 1년이 지났는데 여기서는 실제로 몇십 년이 지나는 일이 가능하다는 거를 이야기를 해줘서요. 이거는 사실 시간 여행이 아니라 그냥 가능한 물리적 상황이에요. 물론 그러니까 이론으로 존재한다는 말이 뭐 금방 우리가 그걸 구현할 수 있다 이런 뜻은 아니에요. 그건 조심하셔야 되는데, 그러니까 저희가 이제 이 유리잔을 이렇게 하나씩 쌓아 올릴 수 있잖아요. 중심을 집어가면서. 이걸 100만 개 쌓아 올리라 그러면 이론적으로는 가능해요.
그런 개념이다.
아까 봤던 SNS 있었죠. 바로 그 사람은 하비에르. 스페인 사람
2097년에 살고 있다.
하다가 눈을 떴더니 병원이야. 기억이 잘 안 나. 사람이 아무도 없고 밖을 나갔는데 이상. 광고판도 2021년과 슈퍼마켓에 갔는데 유통기한이 2021년 11월 이런 거야.
아까 이 사람이 2027년에 살고 있으면서 SNS상으로 2021년에 우리 와서 통하는 게 아니라
2021년으로
떴던 21년으로 온 거네.
그치. 사람들이 처음에 이제 어떻게 믿냐, 뻥치지 마라. 막 이런 댓글만 달리다가 계속 이 사람이 이러니까 미션을 내기 시작해요. 공항에 여행을 가는 사람을 못 가게 하더라도 공항 직원들은 있어야 돼요.
있어야죠. 기본적으로 상주하는 직원들이 있잖아요.
24시간 열려있는 곳인데. 축구장도
청소로 아니야?
청소하는 사람이 있거나 관리인들은 있어야 되잖아. 근데 아무도 없는 거야.
근데 무섭겠다. 발레시아야? 이강인.
이강인이다.
근데 라커는 아무나 못 들어가지 않나? 그렇죠.
여기는
못 들어가죠.
이월이면 시간 여행만 있는 게 아니라 다른 차원, 그러니까 공간에 있으면서 일부만 보이는 뭐 이상한 상황인 것 같아요.
그러니까 사람이 없다고 하니까.
그래서 이건 너무 저런 게 끝이 아니고요. 저런 게 200회가
저 사람이 찍은 게?
네. 자기만의 어떤 공간에 갇혔다. 이 순간 아까 바로 거론했던 영화가 하나 있잖아.
인터스텔라.
그 인터스텔라에 보면 이제 웜홀이라는 게 등장하는데, 웜홀을 이용하면은 타임머신을 만들 수 있을지 모른다는 것이 이론적으로 가능한 시간여행의 형태인데, 그러니까 웜홀이라는 것은 공간상의 두떨어진 지점을 바로 연결해 주는 거라고 생각하시면 돼요. 예를 들어 여기 웜홀 구멍이 하나 있고 종신시 옆에 구멍이 하나 있다 그러면 이 두 지점은 연결된 거예요. 제가 일로 손을 집어넣으면 앞으로 손이 나오겠죠. 이게 연결된 거죠. 자, 이제 제가 이 웜홀을 가지고 여행을 떠나요. 영화를 기억하시겠지만 제가 쿠퍼와 마찬가지로 블랙홀 근처에 갔다가 돌아오면
저는 한 1년밖에 안 지났지만 여기는 지금 수십 년이 이제 지나 있는 상황이죠. 워몰을 내가 만약에 이 시점에서 통과하면은 1년밖에 지나지 않은 이 공간을 가게 되는 거죠. 이게 시간 여행의 아이디어.
There's a speed trap ahead.
문제는 과연 이 워몰이 우리 같은 사람이 통과할 만큼 크고 안정하게 있는지 이런 거에 대해서는 알 수 없고 아직까지 워몰이 발견된 적도 없고 이론적으로는 가능하지만 너무 어렵다.
화제가 되고 SNS 난리가 나니까 스페인의 한 방송인 다미안이라는 사람이 SNS에 미션을 걸어요.
Me encantan tus vídeos.
이 사람이 다미안이야.
Así que, mira, voy a escribir aquí los conos.
책을 찾아가라고 미션을 제안하는 거죠.
주변에 사람이 있죠, 이거.
Y tú vienes y lo coges, ¿vale? Aquí viene. Mira, ¿ves?
Un 스튜디오네, 심지어.
Ahí está.
하비에르는 미션을 받아들였어요. 그리고 스튜디오에 다녀간 영상을 인증했어요. 한번 보시죠.
미쳤다.
와, 미쳤네.
사람이 왜 없냐고. 있어? 찾았어? 아, 뭐야 이게.
In 2 miles, take exit 416A, 416B toward I-140 West.
CCTV.
Es que te lo digo que lo vas a flipar. Mira, 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 mira. ¡Ay, ay, 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 ay!
¿Cuánto?
¡Mira eso! ¡Míralo, míralo! Te lo dije, mira.
이거 뭐야?
에이, 진짜라고? 이거 문이 열렸어.
문이 열렸어.
우리 시간이 여기라고 치면 하베르가 있는 거 공간이 다른 거잖아요. 근데 여기에 있는 물건이 어떻게 여기로 전달이 되냐 이 말이야.
여기가 이제 무에도 나오는데 이게 이제 여기가 뒤틀려가지고.
그러니까 그게 뒤틀린 곳에서는 그게 전달이 되는데 아무 데서나 저렇게 다 뒤틀리지. 그러니까 보통 완전 분리가 돼야 되죠. 그러니까. 근데 여기선 지금 분리가 된 건 아니고 생명체만 안 보이는 그런 상황을 안 보이는 거죠. 물리적.
In half a mile, take exit 416A, 416B toward I-140 West.
현재 CG 기술로 영상에서 그 사람들만 다 이렇게 지울 수가 있어요.
그런 문제제기를 하실까봐 영상 분석가, 전문가님에게 그걸 다 보고 분석을 좀 해달라고. 나는 비과학 안 믿어. 난 과학만 믿어.
Take exit 416A, 416B, then keep right at the fork to continue on exit 416A.
해야 되는데요. 뭔가 합성을 하고 주장을 하게 되면
Keep right at the fork to continue on exit 416A.
객체들을 가져다가 합성을 해서 지워버려야 되거든요. 하늘이라든지 단색 배경이라든지 이런.
Continue on I-140 West for 7 miles.
지금 같은 경우에 도심에 이런 건물도 있고 나무도 있고 자동차도 있다 보면은 윤곽선이라든지 그 패턴에서 오류들이 생겨요. 근데 그런 것들은 전혀 식별되지 않았어요.
식별되지 않는다.
나도 사실은 이 기이한 상황은 무엇인가 하면서 자꾸만 고민을 하게 되는 거야.
그러니까.
그러다가 또 다른 시간 여행자의 이야기를 찾아내게 됐어.
누구야 이 사람?
이 사람은 우크라이나의 세르게이 포노마렌코.
이게 뭐예요? 여권이에요?
신분증. 근데 뭔가 이상하지 않아? 2006년 4월 23일에
2006년
키예프 우크라이나의 수도입니다.
네.
지나가는 사람들을 붙들고 어떤 남자가 지금이 몇 년도예요? 이러고 있으니까 좀 이상하잖아. 경찰이 신분증을 요구했어요. 구 소련 시절의 신분증을 내놓으니까 출생연도가 1932년이에요. 이른이 넘어야 되잖아.
근데 사진에는
젊은 남자야. 너무 이상하잖아.
그 이상하다.
그래서 이 사람을 정신병원으로 데리고 와.
Меня зовут Сергей. Родился в Киеве 17 июня 1932 года. Последнее, что я помню, это среда 23 апреля 1958 года.
되게 날짜가 구체적이다.
У меня был выходной, и я просто решил выйти прогуляться. взял фотоаппарат и уже во дворе в небе увидел странный объект.
이상한 물건이 있는 걸 봤어요.
Он был похож на колокол, но это что-то другое, и летел он по какой-то странной траектории. Когда я его сфотографировал и опустил объектив, увидел вокруг себя другой мир.
98년이 완전 다르지. 2000년이면.
그렇지.
근데 기이한 일은 이제부터. 병실에 들어가고 나서 흔적도 없이 사라지는.
이 사람이 진짜 없어졌다고?
근데 CCTV를 돌려봐도 병실에서 나가는 장면이 없었죠.
아 진짜요?
아까 세르게이가 왜 종처럼 생긴 뭔가를 찍었다고 자기가 그랬잖아.
네네네.
찍었다고.
그 카메라에 있던 필름을 준 거야. 의사한테. 그 필름을 인화를 해봤어요. 그랬더니
되게 중요한 단서인데.
뭐 여자친구일
수도 있고, 뭐 여동생일 수도 있고,
부부 사이일 수도 있고.
뭐 할머니가 될 수도 있고.
이 사람
찾아야지.
그래서 경찰이 사진 속 여자를 찾아냈어요.
어머. 약혼녀.
오 맞아 입모양.
야 이거 미쳤다.
Сережа был странным человеком. Он говорил такие вещи, которые в то время невозможно было подумать. И он думал, что видит будущее. С ним что-то вдруг изменилось.
현재를 살고 있는 60대 여자분이 세르게이에 대한 기억을 얘기하네.
5. Можете сами посчитать.
1978년에 갑자기 세르게이가 또 사라졌대요. 어느 날 세르게이가 사진을 보내왔대.
78년도에.
와.
그리고 사진 뒷면에 난 괜찮아. 돌아가도록 할게.